Hey everyone, this is GM Josh Fidel. I have been neglecting my YouTube channel a bit. I've been meaning to make it more regular, but today I had a bit of extra time, so I thought I would make a video. I kind of got inspired to make this from a lesson I taught yesterday, and actually two lessons I taught yesterday. And I didn't use the same position. This position I just used in one of them, but it was really just about how to improve at calculation. And there are a couple ways I like to go about it. There's one way where you kind of do positions where you have to calculate and you calculate as you would in a game. I think this is really important because that's how you're supposed to calculate as you're playing. But kind of like how if you play a sport, like people play whatever it is, I'm going to say tennis because that's what I play. But take whatever sport you want, right? If you look at professionals, they spend a fair amount of time, playing the sport and practicing playing the sport. But they also spend a fair amount of time in the gym, or they just do something where they're just hitting balls at a certain place, which they would never do normally in a game, but they're practicing one particular thing. But the gym is really where I kind of get this inspiration from, because the fact is that, that's not really what you do during a match, but that's how people train. Why is that? Well, you're trying to build your muscles, build your skills. And believe it or not, chess calculation works in much of the same way. You might think of it as, well, just what are you doing during a game? But really, it's a collection of many skills to calculate. It's not just one skill. There's tactical skill. You have to be able to see the tactics in a given position, or just board awareness, seeing what pieces are attacked, things like this. You have to be able to visualize a position into the future. That's part of calculation. You have to be able to kind of figure out what's going on in a given position to know where to direct your calculation. Being able to calculate by itself is nice, but if you don't know the direction you should be headed or what's going on in a position, your skill is not going to be that useful, quite honestly. It's kind of like you're able to drive, but you have no idea where you're going. Like, where are you headed? And there's numerous other skills, right? There's the ability to spot tempo moves or forcing moves. And that's like a really important thing to build your ability to do in any position, because really the tempo moves tend to give you direction as far as where to look in any given position. So this position I like to use. I used it yesterday. I've used it a few times before. It's a position from a game, Chiburdenice against Malanyuk. So Chiburdenice is a Georgian Grandmaster, one of the strongest female players. I mean, you could argue of all time, sort of, but was a pioneer and all of this. And Malanyuk is a very, very strong Russian Grandmaster. And they reach this position. And again, the position itself is kind of like not as important when because you're going to the gym. It's not so important, what position you're using or what you're doing. It's more about how you use it, right? It's not about the individual weight that you have. It's about your technique in lifting it and all of this. I'm going to ease off on the analogies. I'm too bad at it, clearly. But you kind of get the idea, right? So I gave this position to the student, and the first thing I asked is, what's going on in the position? And they gave me a pretty good summary. They were basically like, well, white's down a pawn. You always start with material, down a pawn. Black's king is clearly a bit vulnerable. In particular, and this was something they didn't emphasize as much as I'd have liked, but this f7 pawn looks particularly weak and vulnerable to attack. Our pieces are pretty good, but could become better. Black's pieces are largely quite awkward. The d pawn could become dangerous, but at the moment, black has a lot of pieces covering the square in front, so it's unlikely to be dangerous right now. So something like this. Then what's attacked? Another good question. At the moment, the main thing that's attacked is the rook on b1. This is something my student actually missed, even though he's quite a strong player. But this kind of thing happens all the time if you don't ask yourself. So you ask yourself, what is being attacked in the position? So these are all just kind of nice setup points. So the next is, what are your tempo moves? So you can come up with rook takes b6, knight takes f7. Those are captures. Knight takes h7 is a capture. Clearly not a very good one, but you could list it. Again, moves like queen takes c5, it's nice to list, but they're not doing much. There's also moves like bishop c4, targeting f7, things like this. So I said, okay, pick a tempo move that you'd like to start with. So they choose knight takes f7, which is fair enough, right? So here's where you kind of go to the gym. You're basically like, okay, knight takes f7. Now, my student immediately said, well, king takes f7, bishop c4 check. Hold the phone. Go back. After knight takes f7, what are black's tempo moves? So, and this is a great skill, and you can do it yourself as I'm going along with the video. After knight takes f7, what are black's tempo moves? Again, tempo moves meaning checks, threats, and captures, forcing moves. You can focus on forcing moves that are somewhat relevant, but anything that's like a capture and stuff like that should sort of be listed. So for example, bishop to b2, attacking the queen, hanging the bishop is not a move you have to really list, but anything reasonable, right? So that includes rook takes e2, bishop takes b1, and king takes f7. So, you know, that's where you start. So which one would you start with? Let's just say king takes f7. It's the most direct. Fair enough. So what happens after king takes f7? What are white's tempo moves? So once again, this is something that you do each move. And what it does is it forces you to always consider the different options for each side when there's a lot of forcing moves. This is a skill that a lot of people neglect. What people do when they practice calculation is they look at one move all the time. Whether it's knight takes f7, whether it's rook takes b6 or bishop c4 or what have you. After knight takes f7, they assume you have to play king takes. You don't. And things like that. So making sure you look at all the tempo moves. This is a way of, you know, practicing. Again, it's like a weightlifting thing. So knight takes f7, king takes f7. So, you know, we're like, okay, well, let's start with rook takes b6. So I actually think that's a pretty good move to start with. It doesn't have to be, though. For example, you could start with bishop c4 just as easily. My student thought that bishop c4 was not as instinctively good because it allows knight takes c4, and that takes away a key attacker. I agree with this sentiment. But it is a move you can start with. So for example, here's a question you can ask. After knight takes f7, king takes f7, bishop c4 check, knight takes c4, queen takes c4 check. Notice how even there's multiple captures. There's rook takes e8, there's rook takes b7 check. I always list things like rook takes b7 check because in the correct moment, that might be a very strong move. And people tend to forget that once the knight on b6 moves, you have an additional tempo move at your disposal. So again, knight takes f7, king takes f7, bishop c4 check, knight takes c4, queen takes c4 check. And then let's say the move rook e6. You could also play bishop e6, amongst other things probably. So, but let's just say for the moment, rook e6. So I'd like you to pause and tell me what's material there. Takes you a minute, right? So this is the kind of thing that you do. Again, it's another form of exercise. You want to be able to look at the position in front of you and go, what is material here? So let's look. In the current position, what's material? In the current position, black is up a pawn. After knight takes f7, black is no longer up a pawn. We're even. King takes f7, black has an extra knight. Bishop c4 check, no change. Knight takes c4, black has an extra knight and bishop. Queen takes c4 check, black has an extra bishop. Note how it changed to a bishop because we gave up our bishop for their knight. So black has an extra bishop. And let's say the move bishop e6. Again, it doesn't matter for our current purposes. So after bishop e6, we're currently, what is material? We're down a bishop. So then I would ask, where are all the pieces? Again, this is a particular skill. Part of this is visualization. You want to be able to look at that position and know where all the pieces are. So again, take a moment, try to do that. The great thing about this is you don't need a special position. You don't need this particular position to work with. You can use any position, practice this skill, and ask yourself these questions. Where are all the pieces? So at the moment, what pieces are off the board? It's a good place to start. So at the moment, the pawn on f7, the knight on b6 are off the board. The bishop on e2, the knight on g5 are off the board. That's why we lost our piece for the pawn. The black kings on f7, our queen's on c4. This bishop moved back to e6. Otherwise, every piece is where it is. Now, it's really helpful if you can immediately go queen on c4, rook on e1, rook on b1, bishop on h6 against bishop e6, rook e8, rook a8, queen c8, bishop h8, king f7. Always list the kings too, king g1, king f7. And your goal is to be able to do this as quickly as you can. Now, you shouldn't immediately try to do it quickly. You should really start slow. Do not try to do this in a really quick way right away. You actually want to take your time and make sure you get it right. But your goal in the end is to be able to do this. So again, these are just ways you build your calculation muscle, whether it's visualizing. That's a particular skill. Think of it as a particular weight you have to lift. Think of looking at the tempo moves, knight takes f7, bishop c4, whatnot. So in the end, that ends up not being so promising. And it's funny because at some point my student asked me, well, would you, is this the same exact kind of stuff you would look at? And the answer is kind of yes and no. So this is where practical play and learning to calculate in a game, you don't lift weights the same way you would play a game, or you don't hit and practice this exact same way you would in a game. In a game, there are different things, and part of that is sorting for relevance. You're not trying to build your muscles in a game. The idea is you have your muscles going in and you can use them to do what they need. But I believe in the concept of headroom. So what that means is you want to have the calculation ability to see really far ahead and see really complex things, but in a lot of positions, you won't have to actually use all of that. In a lot of positions, you can do it in an easier way. So in this position for me, knight takes f7 is not the first move I would calculate, and not the first move I would be drawn to, simply because it's not that forcing compared to other moves. Rook takes e2, bishop takes b1 are available as options. After, there are so many moves where black has an alternative that I just don't like the fact that it is not quite that forcing. I also don't like taking f7 with a knight. It sounds weird because I do believe it's a weakness, but I would rather target the pawn rather than sacrifice on that square. So notice how I'm kind of leading towards the move I want to play without having to use my calculation muscles, for example. I'm using logic, I'm using other tools. So the move I would really calculate and I would focus on is the move rook takes b6. The reason why is I want to play bishop c4, but at the moment bishop c4 is a bit of a blunder. Can you see why? So again, pause if you'd like. But the general idea is bishop c4 immediately. The knight can take it, but more importantly, black can start with rook takes e1 check. So we're looking at bishop c4, rook takes e1 check. So, oops, sorry. I didn't actually mean to do that. I'll play the moves on the board. Typically, I don't like to do this when doing them, but just so you illustrate what I mean. And then you lose this bishop. Now, again, you can try moves like queen e7. I'm not saying the line ends, but for me, the line kind of ends because there's too many options that black would have. After queen e7, for example, if I really want to, I could even take this pawn. If you take the knight, your rook is still hanging. As long as I don't blunder mate, I think that I'm going to win this game. So you eliminate a move like bishop c4 very quickly. So let's get back to good habits. Rook takes b6. Once again, I had my student pause, and what's interesting is immediately they're like, oh, black can play rook takes e2 in addition to rook to a takes b6. And this is quite relevant because it prevents you from putting a bishop on c4. So you have to ask yourself, after rook takes b6, rook takes e2, what happens? So one nice trick that you can use is that notice how rook takes e1 check is a tempo move. That means that it's very unlikely you're going to find a better move than capturing the rook. Because you either have to move this rook somewhere really great where it doesn't hang. Like you can't get in a move like rook takes b7 because I'm going to play rook takes e1 check and queen takes. So rook takes b6, rook takes e2, rook takes e2. A takes b6 is fairly forced. So again, what's material? If you look, we've both lost a rook and a knight. Or rather, black's lost a rook and a knight, and we've lost a rook and a bishop. The a pawn is on b6. This matters because it does open up this a rook. And our rook is on e2. So visualize all the pieces, know where all the pieces go. Right? We're still using those habits. We're still trying to work that muscle. These are all things that will help you as you're calculating in a game or in any situation. So rook takes b6, rook takes e2, a takes b6, rook takes b6, rook takes e2, rook takes e2. See, I go too fast, I get messed up too. A takes b6. So once again, you pause. What are white's tempo moves? There's d7, there's rook e8 check, there's knight takes f7, and there's queen c4. Very soon, my student saw, queen c4 threatening mate. That has to be high on the list. So then there's the question, what are black's reasonable defenses to the move queen takes f7 mate? There aren't many. Most of them hang the queen. You can never really allow the queen to capture here. Even if this bishop moves, it's not going to spare you from mate for very long. So the only moves you have to look at are the moves queen d7 and bishop e6. So you spot that and then eliminate them one by one. Here's a nice question for you. After bishop e6, would you like to take with the rook or would you like to take with the knight? What do you think? So once again, picture that position. Notice how material is still even before you capture that bishop, or rather black's up a pawn the same as they are here, I should say. But the question is, what do you want to take it with? So it looks like both rook takes and knight takes are extremely powerful, but it turns out that only knight takes is strong. It is the best move, and the reason why is because after rook takes e6, f takes e6, if you're following along. Knight takes e6. So again, the line is rook takes b6 first. Let's start again. Rook takes e2. Rook takes e2. A takes b6. I'm actually not even doing arrows. I want you to be able to visualize this in your head. If you have to, pause your video. Try to go very slow. Queen c4. So we're threatening mate. The bishop comes back to e6. We're taking it with the rook. The pawn will most likely recapture. It doesn't have to, but the problem is not only are you did you capture a bishop, so you're up a piece at the moment, you're also threatening rook takes g6 check, nasty little check, and then queen f7 mate. So black pretty much has to recapture. It's always nice to know your precise threats. The fact that you're threatening rook takes g6 severely limits black's options. So f takes e6, knight takes e6. You don't really want to trade queens there. But then the question is, what is black's saving move? Can you figure it out? And what I would recommend is ask yourself, what are black's tempo moves? How can they attack? So once again, summarize that position after knight takes e6. What's material? Where are all the pieces? And what's happening? These are questions you want to ask yourself all the time. If you ever struggle to know where all the pieces are, to struggle to know where material is, go back to the beginning, go back to basics, and count as you go. Rook takes b6, I'm up a piece for a pawn. Rook takes e2, I'm down a pawn. Rook takes e2, up a rook for a pawn. A takes b6. It's tedious, but you want to get to the point where your brain does this more or less automatically, because that will free you up to calculate other things, to see other ideas. It's very difficult to calculate ahead if you don't master these skills, if you haven't built up your muscles, if you will. So this is how you build up those muscles. Again, you can do this in any position. I particularly like this one, but you know, you can do whatever you'd like. In any case, again, if you'd like to pause, feel free. But in that position, black's saving move is the move b5, because it hits the queen and puts black and makes it so that it's really hard for white to deliver mate. Let me play through this line so you can see. Rook takes b6. Is this the position you saw in your mind's eye? Queen threatening the pawn here. So if rook takes e6, pawn takes. Notice how we're down an exchange, a rook for a knight, and they also have an extra pawn. We take here. Now we're just down a rook for a knight, but look at this king. We're threatening to move the knight with checkmate, but they have this move. The point being, if we capture the pawn, our knight hangs. If they try to go here, I believe we have this move. Again, threatening the queen trade and preventing them from moving the knight with mate. They can trade and try to push their pawn, but I believe here we can play bishop f6, guarding. This is very, very difficult to see in advance, but the fact that b5 exists is a very important resource and one you would like to see in advance. So in that sense, knight takes e6 is in some ways a nicer move. Notice how we're up a knight for a pawn. The great thing here is if they recapture the knight and we take, we're threatening rook e8 double checkmate. That's hard to defend against. And checkmate will come very swiftly here. There's no real defense. You can try b5 here, but the nice thing now is if we need to, we can play queen to d5. And if they play a move like queen c6, at the very worst, we can simply trade and move our knight. Because we haven't sacrificed anything, we're now just up a piece. And have a killer d-pawn, this position will not be very challenging to win. It will be actually challenging to really not win. In any case, so that's kind of how this line works. There's also the move queen d7. And again, this is something you could have pictured before. But here we have the move rook e7, so queen take f7. And this position was a funny one. I asked my student this one. And it's funny because he was listing all the moves and he's like, well, there's queen takes e6, but that doesn't seem that great. And it's funny because to me, queen takes e6 is the easiest move. The reason being that here, black's reply is almost completely forced, because if they take with the pawn, we take the queen, we're up a knight. If they try to take the pawn or the rook, well, if they take the pawn, we can mate them. Or take the queen, and we can always take with the queen. We don't have to take with the pawn, so we're simply up a queen, mating. So they have to take this way to at least snag our knight. But the problem is we're in time to play d7, and rook e8 check is unstoppable. And is going to be quite strong, and our pawn will queen or will win material of some sort. A hefty amount of material, let's say. So kind of a nice little line. But to be able to spot all the captures is a skill that you get from, again, practicing tempo moves on each move, knowing where everything is, and not eliminating queen takes d6 just because it looks like it gives up a queen. In fact, I think it's maybe the simplest way. If knight takes, I think this is also completely winning, but there's queen takes d6 you have to calculate now, and make sure you have mate and all of this other stuff. You have a lot of stuff hanging. To me, this is at least a little more challenging. It's still pretty winning. I'm sure rook takes f7 is still winning, but okay, it's an additional amount of work. Again, if you do the work and calculate the line, it doesn't matter which one you choose. I found queen takes e6 to be simpler because the lines are more straightforward. So moving back, there's one more line I'd like you to look at, and that is rook takes b6, a takes b6. So again, what are the main tempo moves? Bishop c4 is the really big one. So what are black's possible responses? Our threat is bishop takes f7 mate. That is a monstrous threat. There's no way black can really allow us to take that pawn, which means there aren't that many defenses. Rook f8 is possible, but we can capture that rook if we'd like, and then that doesn't help the f7 problem. They can play rook takes e1 check, stops it temporarily, but after queen takes e1, we're doing pretty well. Notice how in that position after queen takes e1, we're down an exchange and a pawn, but because this pawn on f7 is so weak, black's basically dead. They can play bishop e6, but we can simply capture it, and we're kind of ready next move to just go back to g5 and renew our pressure when now we have two pieces for the rook and a pawn, and the two pieces, especially in the middle game, are extremely strong. So the real question is, what happens after rook takes b6? A takes b6, bishop c4, bishop e6. So I invite you to pause your video and try to figure out how to win there. One thing that's cool is that you actually have lots of roads that lead to Rome, say. And again, so pause if you really want to solve it yourself. If you're just along for the ride, then the cool thing there is we actually have multiple ways. So here's where the cool line, and I'm going to play it on the board, but again, try to visualize it in your mind if you can. I'll actually say it first and then play it. Rook takes b6, a takes b6, down an exchange and a pawn, bishop c4, bishop e6, still the same. Rook takes e6. So knight takes e6 is also a good move. Rook takes e6 is more natural for me because the knight and bishop apply the maximum pressure on the f7 e6 squares. Little trick, but knight takes is also quite good. So of course the rook can capture. That doesn't lead anywhere good, but it's definitely a legal thing. But let's say that the pawn captures on e6. So at the moment we're actually down two exchanges and a pawn, quite a bit of material. But we have the move queen f4, threatening mate on f7. There's no real great way to defend against it except for the move queen d7. Rook f8, we actually have a really cool line, which goes queen takes f8 check, queen takes f8, bishop takes e6 check, and we actually mate them. Once again, if you're having trouble visualizing, go slow. Try to cover it move by move. The tricky thing after queen f4 in that position is they can play queen d7, but the question is, how do we dislodge their queen? Try to figure that out. Not so easy. But we have a very, very cool idea. So let me show you on the board. Rook takes b6. And this is the kind of thing where you want to go as long as possible without playing the moves on the board. That's how you build your muscles, which is your main goal here. But bishop c4, bishop e6, rook takes e6. So again, the rook can take, but the general problem here is that you have way too many threats. Bishop e6 is a huge threat. You could check here. So notice how the bishop can't really block because you go here and there are way too many threats. You can't go here because I have this kind of thing and your whole position's falling apart. So the king probably goes back. You can't really go up either because you're going to get horribly mated. So queen e4, threatening the pawn again. And the key tactic you have is bishop takes e6 check, followed by queen takes b7 check. So in the game, after rook takes e6, I believe f takes e6 was played, and Chiburdanidze found a really cool idea. Queen f4. So once again, if rook f8, there might be more than one way to do it, but this is a beautiful way to end the game. Check. Nice mating pattern to make a note of if you haven't seen it before. So the move queen e7, and here is where a lot of people get stuck, and if you get stuck, you can't play this line if you don't see this move, because it's not clearly winning, I don't believe. But you have the move bishop b5. Notice how it's a very unexpected move, because you're taking the bishop off that's diagonal, but you're distracting the queen from guarding the f7 square. So a really beautiful way to end the game. No doubt a move missed by Malanyuk, although he was already in danger, so who knows. But notice how when I ask what the tempo moves in this position are, if you're looking ahead, that should be on the list. And it's one of those moves, because it's unexpected, if you make a habit of looking at all your tempo moves or forcing moves in every position, you're much more likely to see it. So bishop b5, rook f8, bishop takes d7, and you capture and get to checkmate in a glorious fashion. One thing I would note, though, is that let's say you are low on time or don't spot bishop b5. This is where the practical side comes in, more than the building muscles side. You can take this bishop with the knight and play bishop here to e7, and this is very easily winning. Like, no problem winning a position like this, in my opinion. So this would be actually kind of the lazy, easy way to do it. Not as beautiful, but sometimes beauty is not necessary to win a chess game. In fact, sometimes it gets in your way. So doing something like this is perfectly fine. So in a practical sense, I would say I would love to spot rook takes e6. I would like to think I would, but if I didn't, I'd like to think this is what I would play and probably still win very easily. So a really kind of cool example. I'll put this position on the board because it's such a beautiful end to the game. But notice how you can use this, kind of tactical puzzle, you could call it, or whatever you want. But notice how every move, just visualizing what's going to happen, calculating, forcing yourself to do these, exercises, that's really what builds your calculation muscle. And it makes it so that, you're it's easier to look ahead in a chess game. It's easier to, figure out like how to do a position, how to summarize it. Like all these things are important kind of, ingredients in the calculation soup, if you will. And you want to work each one individually when you can. Doing puzzles and just trying to solve them is great. But doing these kind of exercises where you're trying to visualize, you're trying to count tempo moves, you're trying to know, okay, what's material in this position and know all the time to be able to go move by move is something that will really build your skills. So then when it comes time to play a game, or you are like in real time having to figure things out, you just have a much greater toolkit that's been worked harder, and you're going to find it's easier to calculate ahead as you play. But do keep in mind that in a game, you don't want to do all of this unnecessarily. In a game, you want to do what is necessary to figure out the best move in the position, which is your only real task in any chess position, is to find the current best move. But sometimes to do that, you have to look farther ahead. Having these tools will help you a lot. In any case, I hope you found this video useful and cool. Definitely like and subscribe if you like it. If you like my teaching style and are interested in other things I've done, you can check out a link to my Chessable course. Mostly aimed at beginners, but some stronger players have also found it useful. And stay tuned. I'm going to really try to do more videos for this channel. So again, hope you liked it. Thanks so much.